Today I am going to be talking about the chapter in Karma Chagme's Mountain Dharma, Volume 1, as taught by Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. This chapter is titled Putting Away the Dice, Abandoning Samsara's Path. Now, right off the bat, this fact of having dice in the title obviously means ending uncertainty. This is about how to escape from samsara or abandon samsara. And of course, very simply, it is renunciation and taking refuge and so forth. And so that is what is discussed in this chapter. There are three paths in Tibetan Buddhism: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. The Hinayana has been changed slightly to the foundation level, or the foundation yana. Gyalwang Karmapa prefers that, and I think also a better choice of words. And then Bodhisattva yana is also used for Mahayana. So to continue here, Rinpoche mentions that there are countless ways to obtain liberation from samsara. It depends on the individual's karma, the individual's motivation, and so forth. And then you have these three main yanas, but then within them, many, many, many different ways of reaching the goal. With that introduction, then the chapter begins with homage and respect to Shakyamuni Buddha, who has accomplished and fully perfected these paths. Now, there is a quote here that I think is important to consider, to contemplate. This is on page 95. You must also understand the many classifications of the path. It is essential to follow the proper path and to know how to face in the right direction in order to be free from wrong direction and confusion. He then goes into discussing the dangers of mistaken paths. Here is a brief rundown of 4 mistaken paths. The first is called the wrong path, and this is the path of negative actions or non-virtue or no virtue. Obviously, that is not going to work very well to get to the goal. The second mistaken path is called the path of the circle. And here you don't know the proper methods. You might believe you're on the right path, but you're actually just spinning around, coming back to the same point. You're moving in circles. This reminds me of a time that I was in the woods that I wasn't familiar with. I didn't have a compass. It was a cloudy day, and I got lost. And I was amazed at how quickly I would be in the same place when I'm trying to get out, that I would keep circling. I could recognize the same place, but I did not recognize how I kept getting there. As you can see, I did eventually get out. But that's what is being talked about here, is that you're moving, but you're not really getting anywhere. Then the third mistaken path is the inferior path. And this one involves engaging in mistaken activities. and you do not arrive in your intended destination. And the fourth mistaken path is, he says, quote, not finding the path, or quote, no path. This means that you're not really searching for any right or wrong path. Now, Rinpoche says we have to understand the dangers of these four mistaken paths so we can avoid them. And I am going to add a little bit here. I just happen to have been in the New York City area Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of last week in a rental car. To give you a little background, the closest town to where I live is 258 people. And right out my window here, I'm looking at my neighbor's herd of donkeys. This couldn't be further from driving in New York City. Needless to say, I put my complete faith in GPS. It was like GPS or I'm not going to get to where I need to go. And I did end up getting to where I needed to go on time and returning to the airport in the rental car and finding the right place at the Newark airport where rental cars are supposed to be dropped off. It's too bad we don't have GPS to determine where we are on the path, but we don't have that, so we have to have a much better idea of where we are on the path. So that is my commentary. Now, Karma Chagme goes into how access to Dharma is rare, and there is this traditional explanation of the four continents, the 8 subcontinents, and that Dharma is only available on the southwestern subcontinent of Jambudvipa, and that we have to remember how fortunate we are that we have come in contact with the Dharma, because even when you are in the land of Jambudvipa, it doesn't mean that it is readily available in all the countries of the world. And Karma Chagme says it's due to the aspiration of Chen Rezi and beings like Guru Rinpoche that have brought Dharma to Tibet. It's also really important to remember that this chapter was written at a very different time. This was written in Tibet in the 16th century when it was a very isolated country. And of course, places like North America, Europe were just unheard of. To go on, Rinpoche says that because of the Buddha Dharma, the possibility of enlightenment is present. We've come in contact with the Dharma, but also, since there is a possibility of enlightenment, there is a possibility of Mara. And he describes Mara as an obstructor of enlightenment. To continue, he says, because there is this possibility of pure Buddha fields, there are also many inferior or impure realms as well. That good and bad exist just like light and dark. In the relative world, you cannot have one without the other. And all of this, of course, is held together through interdependence, interrelationships. So because there is something good, there also must be something bad. He used the example, I believe, of if there is somebody that is tall, it's because there's somebody that is short. Because there is daylight, there is nighttime. To go on, he says that we have to recognize and understand this fundamental point that there are favorable and unfavorable paths, and we can avoid following the negative paths. We have to be aware of them. We have to avoid them, or we're not going to be able to abandon samsara. It's that simple. Now, he talks about different mistaken paths, but he also talks about different paths that are either in different Buddhist traditions or in Hindu, Bon, Taoism, and so forth. And that as Buddhists, as having taken refuge, part of our vow is to not denigrate other traditions. So there's a difference between saying this is a mistaken path and I don't want to take it, and saying this is totally evil or this is totally wrong and so forth. This is kind of a fine line, but I remember Rinpoche once saying this: there are other powerful spiritual traditions in the world, but there are none that are more powerful than Tibetan Buddhism. So this is not denigrating other spiritual traditions, but it is also emphasizing that vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, is very, very powerful. He discusses that one of the essential elements of keeping your mahayana vows are to look at all beings as equal, and that you do not exclude any particular sentient being or particular type or group of sentient being. So that is part of the Mahayana tradition if you're following the Mahayana path. If you are following the Vajrayana or the Tantrayana path, then all sentient beings have Buddha nature. You have to accept that. And he said that the most profound breaking of the samaya of Vajrayana is to develop aversion to Buddha nature. And quite honestly, that shouldn't be too hard to avoid, in my humble opinion. With that background, then, some of these mistaken paths were about people that call themselves Buddhist, but are still following a non-virtuous path, that they do not turn their minds to the Dharma. They do not turn on the right direction on the path and follow what needs to be followed. This can be because of past karma. One practice that is mentioned over and over again, and it is because it was very popular in Tibet at this time, was sacrificing animals to deities. Animal sacrifice, it was popular in the Bon tradition and popular, you might say, in the folk tradition of when negativities arise. It's because of local deities, and so you pacify them by animal sacrifice. Now, Fortunately, we don't have to worry too much about that. I don't think any of the people that I'm talking to tonight have sacrificed animals to pacify local deities. So some of this, again, is very specific to Tibet and to Asia. Now, Karma Chagme continues to say this, that we cannot be certain about being reborn in a higher realm or not. We don't have really any knowledge of past lives or past karma. We really don't know what is appropriate in order to prepare ourselves for future lives. So this is where we have to rely on a virtuous path, either the Mahayana path or the Vajrayana path. He says that if you're practicing non-virtue, it's really the same as being born in a country where Dharma isn't available at all. Then he goes into 4 categories of wrong view. And this is in traditional logic in Sanskrit, which is believing in internalism, believing in nihilism, believing in both eternalism and nihilism, and believing in neither eternalism nor nihilism. He talks mainly about eternalism and nihilism. Eternalism is believing in a being or beings, God-like beings that control, make things happen. And if you please them, then good things happen to you and people around you. And if you displease them, then not so good things happen to you. And the defect of this is, well, you do have a possibility of experiencing rebirth in the higher realms of samsara. You don't have the possibility of experiencing enlightenment or escaping from samsara or abandoning samsara. And then nihilism, this means things like there is really no such thing as karma, that things just happen randomly, that if I behave in a certain way, it really won't make any difference in the long run about whether I have happiness or experience suffering. And there certainly aren't future lives. I think a simple way to explain nihilism is eat, drink, and be merry. So there's no opportunity for enlightenment in nihilism, and there's not even the possibility of being reborn in the higher realms of samsara. There's no reason to practice virtue. It's that simple. Then believing both eternalism and nihilism, this is not discussed much at all, at least that I could find in this chapter. And the same thing about believing in neither eternalism or nihilism. I guess the closest thing to that would be the idea of there being no path. You know, you just don't even know to believe in eternalism or nihilism. You don't have any kind of beliefs. To go on, he says that it's important to determine the authenticity of teachings. we need to be able to recognize when someone is deceiving us, and he gives two stories. One was a man who wanted to marry his sister, so he was a smooth talker, to put it into plain English, and he convinced people, including his sister, that it didn't matter. He had a kind of a nihilistic view that his behavior didn't matter. And I guess eventually he did marry his sister. And then the other one was a man who was greedy and he wanted the property in the area that he lived. And so he created stories about the wolves are going to come and gobble everybody up, even to the point of making wolf prints in the snow. Of course, that story ended when some wise man in the village followed the wolf prints to where they began, which was at the man's door. And suddenly the whole ruse was completely exposed. I remember reading an article by Chandro Rinpoche, and it was titled "Common Sense is Not So Common." I think we could put in here common sense. You want to examine thoroughly teachers that you are following and the teachings that they are giving. And of course, at some point, you have to follow the teacher, but you want to be careful. You want to be wise. You want to use your common sense. Now there is a list. I came up with, I think, 11 different false paths to follow. Many of them don't seem to have a name. There's just more of a description. And I'm going to preface this by saying I was a prison chaplain for 8 years, and I underwent a little bit of chaplaincy training. And one thing that came up right away is that you have a religion that is described by the leaders of that religion. And then you have the way that it is practiced by people that consider themselves practicing that religion. And sometimes there's a huge difference. And this comes to play here in these descriptions of false paths. So the first one is a philosophy that just believes in the law of interdependence, but there's nothing else. Rinpoche or Karma Chagme does not discuss this very much. I really don't have much more to say about that either. But of course, interdependence is that everything is interconnected, that causes and conditions result in things happening, that things don't happen by themselves or they're not caused by a higher power. But just believing in interdependence doesn't get you very far in terms of traveling the path, because you need to have Buddha nature, for instance, and relative and ultimate reality, and so on and so forth. Number two is a philosophy that sounds a lot like nihilism. There is no enlightenment, no Buddha, no virtue, no non-virtue, no cause and effect or cause and result. When one dies, that's it, that's the end. And he continues by saying that if you please the deity, you can overcome negative influences. He also mentions that animal sacrifice is sometimes practiced in this tradition. He finishes up by saying that this existed both in India and Tibet, and it's non-Buddhist. Third one is the people do not believe in enlightenment Buddhas or bodhisattvas. And as a result of this, there's no way of them accepting Buddhist teachers. They don't take seriously the various stories about enlightened beings in the past. They are resistant to believing in enlightenment. And of course, behind all of this is a lot of negative karma from previous lifetimes. And I like this towards the end of his discussion of this. He says, because of this deep confusion, they believe in a false reality. And when I look out at the world today, I see a lot of different realities that people believe in. And I'm using reality in quote marks. They think that it's real. So now number 4 is a non-Buddhist group that has similar beliefs to the above, but they believe in rebirth. It's not based on negative and positive karma. It's based on pleasing the gods. If you please the deity, again, usually with animal sacrifice, and Rinpoche says, or Carmen Chagme says, it's in the chapter anyway, that this can include a human heart that would be included in the sacrifice. Carmen Chagme says that in some cases you might sacrifice 500 to 1,000 hearts in order to please the deity. And again, it's mentioned that this existed both in India and Tibet. The next one is the belief that if you eat food offered to you by another or wear clothes given to you by another, you accumulate their negative karma. And so to avoid negative karma, you don't wear clothes. You apply ashes. And when I've been in India, I have seen men that appears to be what they're wearing is ashes. And it is mentioned that this belief did not exist in Tibet. But obviously, it's a form of extreme asceticism. And I can tell you this, that in Wisconsin in January, you're not going to be wearing ashes. So I don't think that we have anything to worry about falling into that false belief. Now, the next is Brahmanism, which is not that far from Buddhism. The Karmapa in the last few years has been talking about the closeness of some forms of Hinduism with Buddhism. So this is one form that has similarities with Buddhism, but they do not take refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. They do say that ethical behavior is important, and the ethics is very similar to the 10, avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions that are found in Buddhism, and adopting the 10 wholesome actions. This is done to please Brahma. And they also are very strict in maintaining purity of the Brahmin caste. The Sanskrit language is considered the highest language in India, and so the Brahmins will use this various Hindu books are written in Sanskrit. Poetry sometimes is in Sanskrit. So the idea is to be reborn in Brahma's pure land. The next one is a belief that was popular in Tibet, and it is to take refuge in the local deities. You don't take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. It is these local deities that inhabit the mountains, bodies of water, and nature in general. So the idea is that you want to please these local deities, make offerings to them, and take refuge in them. Of course, you can receive some worldly benefits, some temporary benefits from doing this, but there is no ultimate benefit. The eighth one is the Bon religion, B-O-N, and I'm pronouncing it with a Wisconsin accent. I think it's kind of a combination of a P and a B, Pon, something like that, with an umlaut over the O. So you might be able to do a better job of pronouncing this than I am. Anyway, here, the Bon religion is the pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet, and they did have beliefs that were very similar to the 10 virtuous actions, the 10 non-virtuous actions. They did practice animal sacrifice. Karma Chagme mentions the Tibetan king Trisung Dutsen, who brought vajrayana and eventually Guru Rinpoche to Tibet to help pacify country and the local deities and establish Buddhism firmly in Tibet. And one of the things that was done is they kind of, you might say, disguised certain elements of Buddhism to make them look like they were actually from the Bon religion. Specifically, it was mentioned about a terma, and terma were various treasures. Sometimes it would be a written text. It might be an object. It could be a statue. Could be lots of different things that were hidden by Guru Rinpoche and then later were discovered, quote unquote. And then if it was a written terma, it could be a practice that would be done. So it is said here that Guru Padmasambhava hid many teachings that were expressed in a way that it sounded like they were intended for the Bon to practice, and they discovered these and they practiced them, and they really were Nyingma practices and teachings. I remember a long time ago in the late 90s, Barter Tulku Rinpoche came here to my center, and I had an extensive library at that time, and I still do. And there was a book that was written by, I cannot tell you exactly the author, a contemporary author, but it was from the Bon tradition, and it was on Dzogchen. And Barter Tulku Rinpoche knew enough English that he started reading it. And he told me later, well, this is Dzogchen. This isn't Bon, this is Dzogchen, which is Nyingma, the Nyingma version of very close to Mahamudra, which is what the Kagyus practice. They are different, but they're not that different. And so this is what is being talked about here, that the Bon religion after Buddhism was introduced to Tibet, it evolved and became closer and closer to Buddhism. But what is being said here is it's still better to be practicing the Kagyu lineage rather than the Bon religion. So don't get distracted by that. The next is the Ha Shang, which is Chinese. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this comes from China, and it doesn't take you to enlightenment, but it is not negative. They use a meditation like shamatha, but there's no vipassana. Here is a quote: if you believe in the higher realms, that is samsara. If you believe in the lower realms, that is samsara. He also talks about that they talk about getting bitten by a white dog is no different from getting bitten by a black dog, that it's painful either way. You're still getting bitten by a dog. So it is not necessary to abandon a lot of non-virtuous things. Again, the main practice is shamatha, to free your mind from all thoughts, and that's basically it. Then what I have is number 10, and this is a Tibetan practice, which is using shamatha meditation to completely go into a state of what I would say is stupidity. I'll demonstrate it on my face, where you are not really aware of anything. It's blank. You're in a meditation, but you're not aware of visual stimulation, auditory stimulation. You're not going to be eating. You're just in blankness, zoned out. Karma Chagme said this is similar to the Hashang tradition that's practiced in China. The next one is, and I think this is getting close to the end, there are people that practice the 10 virtuous actions and avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions, that practice generosity and even practice Mahamudra, yet they don't take refuge in the three jewels. And as a result of this, there's no way that they can experience enlightenment. They cannot really free themselves from samsara without taking refuge in the three jewels. So that pretty much completes the mistaken paths. Then Karma Chagme talks about the importance of taking refuge in the three jewels, that when you do this sincerely, completely, and when you continually remind yourself of the three jewels being your refuge, then you have every possibility of enlightenment. You're taking refuge in beings that have actually experienced complete liberation from samsara. And they can, having experienced this, they can lead you, and their merit can help lead you to enlightenment. When you have a choice between the Hinayana or the foundation level and the Mahayana, you want to be on the Mahayana level. The Hinayana emphasizes individual liberation from samsara, but it will not take you to enlightenment. It will take you to Hinayana nirvana. So we have to have this Mahayana emphasis on an altruistic attitude and wanting to establish all beings in enlightenment. So once you have made this firm commitment, then you are on the Bodhisattva path. And to end this chapter, Karma Chagme concludes by saying this, quote, "You must properly cultivate the Mahayana tradition of taking refuge and precepts and trusting one-pointedly and wholeheartedly in the three jewels." The question was, well, how do you know that you are following the right path? How do you know that you're following an authentic teacher? Probably everybody thinks that they are on the right path. And I will say this, first of all, I was very fortunate to find Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche fairly early in my Buddhist studies. In about a year, I came in contact with him, and it became very obvious to me that he was authentic for various reasons. But just for everybody, it's good to follow a tradition that you know is established, that it's not just something that sprang up or that some teacher that just suddenly appeared. With KTD, which is the Karmapas monastery, they have authorized teachers. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche would always say, even before the 17th Karmapa was found, the Karmapa is your root guru. The Karmapa is your root guru. Rinpoche would never talk about teachers that he did not have tremendous respect for. So if Rinpoche mentioned a teacher, that was someone that would be a worthy teacher to listen to. So that's one way, but first of all, you've got to find a worthy source to go to. And as implied with a question, you can go on YouTube and you can find anything, anything. There is so much out there at New Age that borrows from Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism specifically, and on and on and on. You have to be careful. Trying to think of how else to phrase this. You don't give up common sense, especially in the beginning, that in the beginning you question, you're examining. You want to look at a teacher. Do they practice what they are teaching? Or are they teaching one thing and then there is something else going on here? I remember going to a temple in Kathmandu that was for Tibetans. I don't know if he was the abbot of the temple or what, but anyway, he was the main guy. Again, I was with a group led by Bardo Tulku Rinpoche. So we got in there, and Right off the bat, Barter Tukel Rinpoche was escorted to a throne, and it was the highest throne I had ever seen. It could easily have been 9 feet off of the floor. And Rinpoche just sat on there and looked as bored as could be. He obviously did not want to be there. And then when they took a break for lunch, we went up into the third floor, the top floor of this, and had a meal with him. Well, I was surprised that there was all this European glassware of women, and each one had a price tag on it. And the monks' quarters in this place, the building looked more like something on the Riviera. It did not look Tibetan at all. And when we were all done and left, I asked Rinpoche about the Lama. And he said, well, I don't know. He went to Europe and then he came back this way. Anyway, be careful. The question is, what is the difference between a reincarnation and an emanation? Now, first of all, technically, they like to use the word rebirth rather than reincarnation, because reincarnation assumes that there is a certain similarity between the previous body and the present body. And that is not necessarily the case. I am not sure if I can give you a really good answer to the difference between an emanation and a rebirth. But in another volume of Karma Chagme's Mountain Dharma, he talks about the pure land you want to be reborn in, because once you are reborn there, you can emanate into any of the pure lands. So when you reach a certain level of realization, you can emanate as anything. You can emanate as another human being. You can emanate as a medicinal plant. You could emanate as an animal. You could emanate as a bridge, I have read and heard, that you can emanate as something that is beneficial to sentient beings. Also, Rinpoche told me, don't talk about what you don't know. And I may be getting to the edge of this, but I believe the 17th Karmapa is not considered an emanation. He is the 17th Karmapa, the continuation of the consciousness of the 16th Karmapa and the 15th and so forth.